Usdin. I'm the Washington editor of BioCentury. I've been covering the intersection of medicine and science and public policy for a little bit more than 30 years, including covering this issue of expanded access for all that time. I have a real interest in expanded access and rare diseases, and really in trying to figure out how public policies make it either easier or harder to turn science into medicine that helps people. So the title of our session is Balancing Access and Evidence Generation. And I want to look at it very broadly to include thinking about the kinds of evidence that are required to enable access, as well as the kinds of evidence that are generated from expanded access. And I want to talk about and consider whether providing pre-approval access confers obligations to generate evidence, and to think about pre-approval access broadly to include not just expanded access, but also access, for example, through emergency use authorizations, which is another form of pre-approval access. And that's the pathway that was used to provide access to COVID-19 vaccines, therapies, and diagnostics. I also want to think about why evidence is collected. Yesterday, there was a lot of conversation about the collection of data for regulators, and I hope that we can also think about the collection of evidence for patients and physicians to help them make better decisions, and for researchers and for payers, because I think that the rigor and the thinking around the collection of evidence changes depending on who the evidence is intended to help. So our panelists have deep experience with these issues. In the interest of time, I'm going to introduce them too briefly, but there's more information, I think, in your programs or online. Lee Fleisher, my far left, is an anesthesiologist and professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. He's a former senior official at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, where his positions included Chief Medical Officer and Director of the Center for Clinical Standards and Quality. Lee was responsible for the decision in April 2022 to restrict Medicare patients' access to the FDA-approved Alzheimer's treatment aducanumab to individuals who were in clinical trials. And then later he helped to set up the parameters for subsequent access to Alzheimer's drugs, including the use of post-market registries. He was at CMS during the toughest part of the COVID crisis. And since leaving CMS in July 2023, he's been very active in public policy development, including advising HHS on pandemic response planning and working on projects at the Bipartisan Policy Center, Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, Faster Cures, and elsewhere. Gregg Gonsalves is an epidemiologist and associate professor at the Yale School of Public Health. And I have to say also kind of a pleasure for me to meet you in person, because I've been seeing you on stages and reading what you've been writing for a very, very long time. In 1991, he co-founded the Treatment Action Group and served as its policy director for almost a decade. At Treatment Action Group and other organizations, Gregg really helped to redefine the relationships between patients, especially those who at the time were marginalized and stigmatized, and FDA, NIH, and the pharmaceutical industry. He helped create the parallel track, a mechanism that allowed patients who could not participate in clinical trials to obtain expanded access to unapproved drugs. Recently, Gregg wrote a piece in The Nation asserting that patient groups are learning the wrong lessons from the AIDS advocacy experience. That article, which touches on a lot of the issues that are being discussed at this conference, has generated a lot of conversations and debate, and I'm going to ask her about it today. And Meeker-O'Connell joined, or actually she rejoined FDA in 2021 as Director of the Office of Clinical Policy and the Office of the FDA Commissioner. She previously served at FDA as Director of the Division of Good Clinical Practice Compliance. After leaving the agency in 2013, she worked in the biopharmaceutical industry, and throughout her career, she's focused on improving the generation of evidence. Gwen Petersen, on the far right, my far right, was diagnosed with ALS at age 32. She's written powerfully about her experience, starting with 1.5 years of misdiagnoses. Since receiving that diagnosis, Gwen has become an advocate for ALS patients. She works with ALS advocacy groups and has served on advisory boards for companies that are trying to develop ALS treatments on the NIH ALS Steering Committee. She's also participated in clinical trials, expanded access programs, and observational studies of investigational ALS treatments. And I want to start, I'm going to start with a question or two individually for each of the panelists, and then we'll have a conversation among all of us, and then I'm going to leave a lot of room at the end for interaction with the audience and questions from those of you who are on Zoom. So I want to start with Gwen, really first to ask you to describe your personal experience, and then to talk about your experience in particular in expanded access programs and in a clinical trial. To talk about how similar or different the experiences from a patient perspective are being in a clinical trial as opposed to expanded access, whether you think that the kinds of data that were collected in expanded access were appropriate, and just generally your thoughts about that whole experience.
Happy to. So I must start and say I've been extremely privileged with regard to the level of access. I've had to one clinical trial and then 2 EAPs with 2 different therapies. It's been 5.5 years since my diagnosis. Really, I shouldn't be sitting here talking to you, walking, eating, even breathing. And so I am, and so I advocate hard for others to have, you know, even a similar level of access to the things I've had. And I attribute my access to, over the years, learning the right questions to ask. As patients, we always need to ask questions. It's gotten to the point where, you know, we have to ask the right questions. Certainly, like anything else, sometimes it's who you know. So I've, again, in 5.5 years, I've gotten to know research nurses, neurologists all over the country. And sometimes to get into expanded access protocols requires you to be on a waiting list. Again, that's not something I would know unless I asked that question, unless I had that experience. So, I mean, it's my duty to share that with other patients. Unfortunately, in both EAPs I participated in, there was really no data collected. It was the periodic ALS-FRS scale, and we all know, well, a lot of us know that scale can be pretty subjective. So it's that one's kind of a hard sell for patients to kind of be on board with as an endpoint. And yeah, and so I'll end with this. Over the day yesterday, it was unfortunate. So many times I heard EAPs are not research. And I think if we, with a well-designed EAP, it can be research. It can be complementary to your trial. So I'll end there.
Well, I do want to actually follow up on that just a little bit and ask you, because that was one of the themes yesterday, and I want to get into it today, which is how much, what's your feeling from the perspective of somebody who's in the EAP about how much data should be collected? How much would you and other patients be willing to do in addition to what your regular care is generate the kind of data that might help others in the future learn from
Yeah.
experience?
So I think having, as much flexibility as possible in terms of at home, like virtual visits. For example, ALS, FRS is not something we need to be in person for. And so for things like that, that can be administered over the phone. Blood draws a little harder. The hospital wants to use their own lab. I get that. But I do think, and especially in COVID, I think one positive thing that came out of COVID was more flexibility in terms of not having to be in person for every visit, more telehealth, things like that. Now, it's a learning curve for ALS. I don't think we have that infrastructure kind of nailed down right now, but we've seen what can be done from COVID.
Well, thanks. And I think we're going to circle back to some of those issues. So Gregg, tens of thousands of AIDS patients receive treatments through the parallel track and expanded access. I see the COVID experience in which millions of Americans received COVID vaccines and therapies through emergency use authorization as a kind of echo of that experience. I wanted to start with to ask you to kind of remind all of us what the parallel track achieved. What did it do for AIDS patients, both those who received access that they wouldn't have otherwise, and for the advancement of science and medicines that led to better cures? And then I want to ask you a follow-up question about the relevance for that today.
Hi, everybody. First of all, I wanted to thank Allison for convening us, but also for a very special reason, because 4 years ago, I got to meet Kathy Collett here, and then got to meet Gwen, then got to meet our friend Sandy Morris, Becky Morey, and other people living with ALS, which is one of the sort of honors of my career as being a patient advocate. I'm living with HIV. I was not around for the beginning of the parallel track. It was people like Jim Igo and Mark Harrington, who are still in New York City, who did that. But in general, the idea was that after, and Richard, just nod your head if I'm getting things right or wrong, because it's a long time ago. But in the context, as things, when finished phase 2 studies, people did not qualify the clinical trials to go into parallel tracks, could go into expanded access programs. And for DDI and D4T, that meant tens of thousands of people got access to the drug before they were approved by the FDA. There was very light data collection, but because of the large numbers, smaller, modest adverse events that you might not pick up in a very small study were able to be seen. I think maybe things like pancreatitis and other things that were common with these early nucleoside analogs. It was very important to us that we balance the need for access and answers. The parallel track was not a substitute for randomized control studies or confirmatory trials in an accelerated approval environment, right? We wanted access to potentially life-saving drugs, but we also knew that no drug is, the myth that any drug is better than no drug at all, or a new drug is better than no drug, or myths not to live by, right? And so we were very supportive of getting early access to drugs, but we were really, really, really insistent that we need to know about what those drugs did in our bodies. And so we were very strong proponents of much more rigorous sort of evaluation of drugs in the early years of the AIDS epidemic than we might have been when we first started out. We used to think that the FDA was killing us, and it was all about getting drugs through the agency was our main goal. As we sort of matured in our thinking, we realized that the FDA was an ally in some ways, and that we needed to get access to those drugs. We also needed answers about them.
So in the Nation article that I mentioned, which was titled "Patient Rights Groups Are Learning the Wrong Lessons from ACT UP," you wrote, "We can reconcile the need for access and answers. Bringing back the parallel track large-scale expanded access programs before marketing approval will be critical. Right now, companies hold patients hostage on access, saying they cannot afford expanded access and faster approval is the only way to get their drugs." Can you talk about that? What did you have in mind? One, are there any particular specific instances? And two, more broadly, kind of what's the message that you're trying to convey?
So the FDA is killing us was the mantra of the early seize the FDA demo that ACT UP did, right? And, you know, not to go into deep history, read Daniel Carpenter's book, Reputation and Power, it's a sort of political history of the FDA. But in the 1980s, there was a really strong push to deregulation, right? Across federal agencies. And the AIDS actors, mantra, the FDA is killing us, was a great tagline, right? For libertarians and Republicans who were really going after the FDA. And what happened is that accelerated approval opened up a Pandora's box. Because what happened is that there was a sort of check is in the mail agreement, right? You'll get approval on surrogate markers, then you're gonna have to come back with your confirmatory studies. And in some cases, the confirmatory studies were too small to show a clinical difference. I voted no on D4T on the FDA advisory committee for that reason. But over the course of years, what we've seen is legislation by legislation that basically starts to hammer away in a death by 1,000 cuts at the FDA's statutory authority to ensure that drugs are safe and effective. There's research by people at Yale that I work with, Joe Ross and Harlan Krumholtz, people like Aaron Kesselheim at Harvard, people like Caleb Alexander at Hopkins, that have looked at sort of the evidentiary burden that is sort of slowly degraded over the course of the past couple of years. All we have to do look is aducanumab. We can look at other drugs that have come through the pipeline, the drugs for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, in which the evidentiary claims in which the FDA approved those drugs were slight or non-existent, and patients sort of fed into that because they were told we can't afford expanded access. If you want to get access to these drugs, get us fast approval. And yes, there's probably no quid pro quo in that way, but for Biogen and aducanumab, there's a lot of stuff going on in which you can see the incentives are built in to push you away from expanded access, to push you away from large-scale randomized studies, and into an accelerated approval environment where you put a drug on the market and we don't even know if it works. And so Lev can make a decision, rightly so, that the federal government should not pay for a drug unless we know that it actually does any good for people living with Alzheimer's disease.
So that's my segue to ask Lee a question, which actually I wanted to start about with your experience with a different kind of pre-approval access with emergency use authorizations from FDA. Millions of healthy Americans received COVID vaccines under EUAs, and a lot of lives were saved. Hundreds of thousands of COVID patients were treated with convalescent plasma under an EUA. There's little evidence that they benefited from that, or if they did, there's little understanding of who did. FDA also granted an EUA for a time for hydroxychloroquine. So what I want to ask you about is the evidence that was generated through the EUA process, whether there was enough evidence generated through that process, and are there lessons that should be learned and applied before the next inevitable pandemic or similar public health crisis?
Yeah, thanks so much, and for the privilege of being here, Allison and Art, if he's watching online. It really was a privilege to be there during those 3 years. And I think what I always come back to is two things. I'm a health services researcher who did claims analysis. So I actually think there's incredible power in even something as simple as claims if you have the right statistical models. Number two is I actually practiced during the entire pandemic. I still gave anesthesia 2 days a week, 2 days a month. So it comes back, and I really want to thank you, Steve, for that initial comment. What do patients, families, and their providers need to make an informed decision, which is very different. If you actually read any of the blogs I wrote about some of my decisions, it always ended with that, because I always thought that was the most powerful. The interesting thing about the EUA is there were a couple things. The most powerful group that gave us information was nursing home residents. So we actually had incredible data, and I oversaw the nursing homes during the pandemic, that we had rules that required us to actually get individual information on who got the vaccine. And the CDC, if you look at all the publications about where it worked, how it worked, it was all nursing home patients. The shame was, and this is really perverse because we never thought about it, because I was there when the vaccine got approved, that by having mass vaccination sites, we lost all the data. Because if Medicare got billed and Medicaid got billed, then we would be able to link it to the claims data, to their demographics, and get more information. I don't always know if it will tell us efficacy, but it actually tells us huge signals for harm. right? So I think we need to make sure that we collect the data, that even if it's as simple as using claims, there's still a lot of power in that to help inform patients. And with the ADUHELM, one of the key questions is, do you need to be at a place like Tisch? Or today, would it matter if it's given in South Dakota? Because that's what a lot of people said, we need access everywhere. But that question can be answered with the simple registry that CMS put out.
Oh, great, and that's another one. I think that we'll circle back to that. Anne, I want to ask you a two-part question. First, I said I've been going to these meetings for a long time and talking about this topic. At every single meeting, and it happened yesterday again, we had this conversation. One of the things that comes up is the question of whether granting expanded access to a drug or to therapy can generate data that will inadvertently, perhaps inappropriately, derail an application, whether something will be uncovered, and then the company will regret that they provided expanded access. So I want to ask you to address that, and I also want to ask you to talk about a somewhat unrelated question, which is your thoughts on the opportunities to use expanded access programs to supplement or improve the collection of data from traditional randomized clinical trials.
So maybe I'll start with your first question. I think it's a topic that our 2022, we put out a updated draft guidance, Q's and A's on expanded access for drugs and biologics that really gets into the question of the addressing some of the fears that you've noted that sponsors may have about adverse event data impacting their application. So I think the guidance talks about and highlights the fact that from a public health perspective, having that early insight into adverse events is really actually beneficial, and reminds people that when our reviewers are looking at data, safety data, adverse event data that come from an expanded access program or IND, they're actually reviewing it in that context, and goes on to note that we're not aware of any instance in which expanded access data, safety information has inhibited or hindered the approval of a product. So I think it's something that we have spoken to in that guidance. If I go back to your other question, maybe I could just start by highlighting that for FDA, our main purpose is to help make safe and effective products available to patients, and expediting therapies for serious diseases, is really in everyone's interest, because it, particularly for treatments where there is, or for conditions where there is no available treatment, or a product represents a significant advance over available treatment. Clinical trials that are well designed generate evidence that supports regulatory decision-making and are the most effective way of making products available to the broadest range of patients. So I think we have pathways like expanded access that allow access to investigational products for patients who have serious or life-threatening diseases that have no other options and are unable to access a trial, whether that's geographically or eligibility criteria. And we are invested in and committed to expediting review of those applications, and also to continuous improvement in the program. And we could talk through any number of improvements we've made. We're also equally invested in modernizing clinical trials and making them more accessible to patients. We have really had a focus on ensuring that trials include representative populations representative of those who are going to, who might receive a product once approved. To Gwen's point, we have put out guidance on decentralized trials and digital health technologies, all in the sense of being able to make it easier for patients to access a trial. So with a decentralized trial, having fewer visits to a site, being able to take advantage of telemedicine, visits to their local healthcare provider, potentially investigational product being shipped directly to their home. With digital health technologies, participants are able to collect data far away from the investigational site. Again, really a lot of focus on how do we bring the trial to the patient. And so in addition, as you noted, we have guidance that we put out in actually at the end of last year, final guidance in December of 2023 for rare diseases that brings in this concept of auxiliary cohorts for rare disease trials. So being able to have a cohort that's focused on safety, where you're able to enroll patients who investigators think might benefit from a product, who might not meet all the eligibility criteria, and really collect safety data in a systematic way. So there are a number of different efforts we have to really focus on the patient perspective, the patient voice, and making sure trials are designed with that patient voice in mind, but are also accessible.
And sorry, Steve, just a quick question for Anne. Certainly you highlighted there is a plethora of resources for sponsors and to, get our trials right. Are sponsors given this information up front, or how are they given? Do they know they have access to it? What does that look like from the get-go?
So I would say that sponsors have access. We make available a lot of the, guidance around policy and recommendations. So that's available to any sponsors. What we highlight in our 2023 rare disease guidance is that early engagement. We want sponsors to come to talk to the review divisions, to engage not just about the clinical trials, but about their development program, because we're really committed to advancing products for rare diseases, and that engagement we want to help people to have successful development programs. So in some ways it's dependent on kind of, whether this particular organization takes advantage of that. We have programs like a pilot, the START pilot just started in CBER to, again, facilitate for a limited number of sponsors, even closer engagement. I think that's the pilot program that's been referenced as by Peter Marks as sort of like Operation Warp Speed, and really being able to have a close connection and questions answered along the way. So there are a lot of tools that are available.
So there are a lot of things that have already come up in the initial comments, and I want to kind of go into a little bit more depth on some of them. One of them is this question of research versus treatment, and kind of I want to ask everybody. Gwen's already said where she falls on that, but what you think about that? Is that a useful distinction? And to the extent that it is, how do you think about expanded access and the evidence and the obligations that should be imposed on sponsors and on patients to collect evidence in expanded access and expanded use?
Yeah, I actually, one of the comments that I found fascinating is this idea that if you find out information as part of expanded access, then that's a bad thing. I mean, it's almost an oxymoron from the standpoint of, isn't all information good? It's just how you use it to make decisions for families and for patients. So I'm a huge believer that evidence generation is critical if we're going to move the timeline of approval up. We need to really have, and you talked about, and Greg, I think the robustness of the need for the accelerated approval pathway to really have that post-approval evidence generation. But I think patients deserve to know if there are adverse events to make an informed decision.
So I think, the way we speak about expanded access is in terms of it's really a treatment use. I think, let me just take a step back and say that kind of our standard for approval remains the same, whether we're talking about a rare disease or another disease. That is substantial evidence of the effectiveness of the product for its intended use and sufficient evidence that the product is safe. We know that rare diseases in particular are complex. There is often not robust natural history. There is often heterogeneity of presentations, differences in prevalence. And, I think why we are committed to engaging sponsors early in terms of discussion on design of a program and having discussion on what flexibilities might be available. Our 2023 rare disease guidance touches on this in context of flexibilities may be appropriate in situations where there is a lot known about the actual natural history of the disease, or the treatment effect is significant and it's a very objective endpoint. So I think we're open to discussion, but I think it's difficult to say that one particular case is representative of all. I think that's where we can get into challenges, that each rare disease is different. So each development program is also going to be unique. And it's really those early engagements that I think are the most beneficial.
And a quick question, because you were very precise in what the statutory definition of approval. And I've heard the commissioner speak a lot about this. It's, substantial evidence for in the population that the drug company actually submits the indication. So I'm just curious how that enters into the fact that the expanded access may be for people who are outside the trial, and why shouldn't we obtain information about that? Because they may never be in the trial.
I mean, I think that, some of it is looking at whether we're talking about an individual patient expanded access request. We're really looking to make sure that there's an option for somebody who has a serious or life-threatening disease who can't access through a clinical trial. I think, sponsors that are looking at expanded access treatment protocols, again, the purpose is treatment, but those are often to those large-scale trials to bridge the gap between, phase 3 and approval. And I think those two traditionally are, focused on the safety information. To the extent there are data about the efficacy that are available, that are robust, I don't think that our review divisions would I'm sure would actually, I think they would consider them, but I don't think it's kind of at the core, the purpose of expanded access. I think to collect efficacy data in that way. I think that's really where I was highlighting that we are looking at clinical investigations and looking at how do we actually improve the trials themselves to streamline them, to really make sure that we're asking a question, a good question with an endpoint and an outcome that is meaningful to patients. So I would tend to focus on the efforts there, where we're trying to make sure that we're confident those clinical trials at the end of the day provide the evidence to be able to say that particular product, the known and potential benefits outweigh the known and potential risks.
So Greg, yesterday, from the audience, you made a comment, I think, about this concept of research versus treatment. Where do you stand on it? What do you think about it?
So yesterday in one of the breakout groups, physicians were saying, I have 15 minutes with the patient, right? I'm typing as I go because I have to put it in Epic, et cetera. If we want drugs, investigational new drugs, through an expanded access program to get out to the most patients in the most diverse populations, adding on layers of research into these programs is a trade-off that you're gonna deprive people of access, right? If you want a local physician to get somebody on an EAP, making it a research protocol is very different. That being said, I use secondary data all the time. I'm a big fan that you can use observational data in a target trial framework to get actual causal effect estimates, right? It's completely different than saying we're just going to have a patient registry or this or that. We can have great observational data to make answer efficacy and safety questions, but an EAP, if it's about access for frontline clinicians and their patients, what's your goal, right? Yes, collect mortality data, serious adverse events, but as soon as you start saying, oh, we're going to collect a little bit of extra blood, we're going to do it, we're going to do this kind of it really sort of works across purposes. This, real world evidence is like a phrase that gets used sort of a little bit too carelessly. And that's another problem in this whole debate, that we think that just because you can collect data on patient outcomes, that it's going to address confounding and bias and all the things we care about. So expanded access should really be about access and expanding it in a way that reduces the burden on patients and physicians and other healthcare workers. We can think about observational data as a way to supplement the data from randomized clinical trials, but I think we have to think about the trade-offs when we start trying to merge it all into one big endeavor.
Gwen?
We heard, to Greg's point, expanded access should be for frontline clinicians and patients. We heard yesterday, Gregg, in our clinician breakout that EAPs are rather burdensome at the site level for clinicians. I guess not so much for patients. Patients want access, but what we heard yesterday is that there is so much on the back end, staffing limitations, money. It seems, to quote Gregg from yesterday, a big hot mess. So yeah, I would like to be rosy about it, but it's just EAPs, it's just not rolling out that way. And despite Steve and I were chatting about ACT for ALS, even despite ACT for ALS, we have this huge, super grateful for the grassroots advocacy that took place and to get 500 million in funding over the next, 4 years? 4 years? 5 years. Diane says 5. I trust her. So yeah, it's extraordinary, but now in practice, it's a little bit different. So maybe a different panel for that, but.
And I'll just interject quickly. The Act for ALS was a law that was passed with after tremendous work from activists that, among other things, provides money for NIH to help stand up and to get patients into expanded access protocols. I want to ask, and we'll start with Gwen and go this way, whether you think that advances in technology, some of them, as you mentioned, as a result of COVID, greater use of telehealth, wearables, sensors.
Yep.
Will they erase some of the friction involved in collecting data in expanded access protocols make it possible to make the collection of data more integrated into routine care?
At least in my disease, ALS, we need endpoints. We need validated biomarkers desperately. So hopefully wearables and all of these speech recognition studies that I'm doing kind of here, there, and everywhere. My data is everywhere, but I digress. Yeah, so hopefully, insights will be gleaned from some of those observational studies to help with validated endpoints and biomarkers. I'd love to hear from Anne as far as what she thinks about all of these, wearable studies, technologies, speech, and yeah. Oh, and Gregg.
So I don't think technology saves us, right? Unless we can integrate research questions into routine clinical practice in the context of an EAP, it's going to be difficult, right? Yes, some of the digital technologies will help us get a little bit further on, but the day-to-day life of clinicians and patients means it has to be seamless. And it's not seamless if we start to add on bells and whistles. That's where I'm coming from. Technology is great, can help get us a little bit further, but I really think we have to just be very, very cautious about turning EAPs into research. Jinsey from Columbia was talking about, even with ACT with ALS, a lot of the EAP work that's coming through that mechanism is turning to research protocols that are really driving us away from the reason the bill was passed in the first place, which is to get patients drugs they need now.
And your thoughts on?
Yeah, sure. I realize we have a limited number of mics for the panel, so we have to coordinate a little bit. I think I just want to touch on your point, Gwen, on the endpoints. And just to make people aware, there's a CEDAR and CBER pilot rare disease kind of endpoints associated to really permit sponsors and FDA to collaborate in really thinking through the development of endpoints for rare diseases. I think, Gregg, I agree with you that kind of having, so when we talked about digital health technology, and those tools have really been in the context of decentralized clinical trials, that those actually are focused on alleviating kind of some of the burden on patients who may have to travel long distances, for example, to sites where many of the sites are located at academic medical centers far away from a potential participant. I think there is opportunity to, and also that if we keep focused on the concept of expanded access as providing access to people who have no other options, can't access the clinical trial, and not complicate I heard your comment, Gwen, that it is challenging. We have made, I kind of highlighted earlier that we had taken steps over the past decade to try and streamline the process. In 2016, we simplified the application form that physicians need to use to request individual patient access to be around a 45-minute endeavor. We also revamped our website, issued guidance documents, again, to make the information about our expanded access programs more readily available. More recently, we've updated guidance on, just as I mentioned earlier, our expanded access Q&As in 2022. Last year, we finalized a guidance focused to IRBs who are approving individual patient expanded access requests to help them think through kind of the key areas and procedures that or processes that they should think about while they're approving the requests. And I think we have discussion in the next session after the break with Tammy Kim from FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence about Project Facilitate. So really trying to support oncology healthcare providers who are submitting expanded access requests. And we also have staff throughout the agency, whether it's in CEDAR's Division of Drug Information or Office of the Commissioner, to support patients and providers who are navigating the expanded access system.
Yeah, I'll actually divide it into two parts. One is technology, but the other is the biomarker comments. And that's become a huge issue. In fact, tomorrow I'll be at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We'll be discussing FDA CMS interactions, and a lot of this was over, is reduction in amyloid the right surrogate endpoint? Is it truly in the biological pathway? And we had a lot of interactions with NIH directors as part of our discussion. And one of the things that I think is going to be important is, FDA and CMS have different statutory authorities. It's safe and effective versus reasonable and necessary for the diagnosis or treatment of a disease or injury. And that differential was actually the basis of many of the decisions we made. But I think we need to get to and we actually are proposing an NIH, FDA, CMS sort of group to say, these are valid endpoints if we're not going to get to improvement in health or improvement in disease. Now, I think movement and some of the others, we would all accept at CMS, the team that I used to lead. But I think as we're getting to more and more surrogates on this pathway, making sure, like you're talking about oncology, is ctDNA, right, the correct surrogate as opposed to tumor burden reduction, which nobody questions right now for oncology. So I think that's going to be an important question for the future as we look at expanded access. What's the right surrogate? The second thing, and I started with your year and a half, and it really is sad, is how is AI going to change all this? And we've done a lot of work in this space. And the hard part is AI is going to actually change the way people think of differentials. They're going to actually get a more expanded differential for some of the rare diseases. I actually think it's going to improve that, as well as potentially improve access to what are the treatments out there. If you ask ChatGPT-4, you may get some additional information. The complex issue will be, how will patients interact with ChatGPT-4, and how will providers, physicians, nurse practitioners, others, because I actually think we don't yet know. I'm a Bayesian. I think that people need to understand what is the prior probability and how to use this information. And there's actually been studies to show, there's one study, that if you let the machine do it or you let the human do it, it goes well. If you put the two together, you actually get less accuracy. So I think as we start thinking through how to treat rare diseases, how to get access for expanded access, we actually have to teach the next generation of practitioners how to use that information to get quicker diagnosis and quicker access to either a clinical trial or a parallel pathway.
And did you want to say something? Yeah. So that actually is a segue into something that I mentioned at the start, which is when we're talking about evidence, it's not just evidence, to me, evidence generation from expanded access. It's the level of evidence that's needed in order for people to make decisions about whether they should participate in that. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that. How well do we do now, and what could be done or what should be done to improve the way that patients and physicians think about not whether expanded access is a possibility, but whether it's something that they should actually participate in.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I hired a linguistic anthropologist and stuck him in the surgeon's office to look at whether informed consent actually exists. And he came up with the conclusion that, you're laughing, so you know the answer, that for us, the people in this room, we're pretty informed. We're not going to take the power differential, and we're going to make, I'm sure that everyone here will make good decisions. I'm concerned that we're going to have people misinterpreting a lot of the information. And I'm not sure, I think we're going to have to think through as clinicians, how we talk to patients who come in with their piece of paper saying, I want this, and how do we inform them, is this good or bad, or what are they missing? I think highly educated people will do well. I'm concerned we could actually increase disparities.
Just back to the Alzheimer's situation. Are we treating amyloid or are we treating Alzheimer's disease? And it's not just about whether you're well informed. You know, there are patient organizations, the Alzheimer's Association. This is a breakthrough in the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. There are people in the Alzheimer's field who are saying we should do early access to some of these new drugs, even though there's questionable efficacy in the target population for those clinical trials. Because if you have amyloid, it's going to lead to Alzheimer's disease. So we got to get to you when you have no clinical symptoms whatsoever. So we have to be really, really careful about when we talk about biomarkers and getting people to put faith in it, whether they are well-educated clinicians or regulatory officials or drug company or patient groups. We need to have a critical eye when we talk about these things, because the whole story of Aduhelm is not a once-off, right? We heard this with Sarepta's drug, that yes, this biomarker, this was good enough to make a regulatory decision, and it probably is good enough to make a patient decision when probably none of us really believed that was true.
Hey, did you want to?
Yeah, I was just thinking of it. Well, there are a couple thoughts. One was just the benefits of kind of going through the expanded access pathways, and the submission to FDA is that the reviewers are actually looking at whether there are potential safety challenges, whether there is this appropriate evidence that there could be a benefit for somebody receiving the product. And also that's kind of framed in, our reviewers I think are well positioned because they are able to look at data and information that may not be available publicly, and really making sure that people have that when an access request comes in, that somebody has exhausted all of their options. So that was point one. I think back to your point on informed consent, I think that's something that would be of benefit to look at kind of across all the clinical trials, expanded access, and how we are conveying information to participants. I think we have an untapped opportunity to meet the regulatory requirements for required elements of consent, but present it in a way that is meaningful to patients, the information they need most first, and streamline. I think in one of my visits as a patient, I was presented with a form that was around 40 pages, which, I think it was, we need you to decide in the next 5 minutes. I said, can I take this home? And they said, you kind of need to decide now. So I think those are the kind of things that I think we also need to talk about across the board, is how do we actually streamline consents, make the information meaningful to patients, fit within some of the context of the visits.
We can have a whole panel on informed consent, and Lee, I wish you were in the clinicians session yesterday. Just the amount of work, the amount of questions. It's just, it's glaring in the last a day and a half. We need to have a whole session about what the questions that come through for clinicians and kind of what they deal with and have to respond to.
And the question is, people say paternalism is bad, but a lot of patients actually ask their clinician at the end, for me, what would you do?
Right.
And so
Yeah, and I actually think that you were being very generous when you're saying that everybody in this room would make wise decisions, because I've been there and I've known people and helped people who've been there. And it's usually, where do I sign? You know, it's not really more complicated than that. So I promised I was going to give a lot of time for interaction from the audience, and I meant it. If there are questions, and I hope there are, or comments, please find the microphones. And is there someone today checking the chat on the Zoom also? Okay, great. Richard.
Richard Klein, GE2P2 and Global Foundation and CUPA member. And I've got so many thoughts running through my head that now they're all confused because there were so many topics shifting around. But I'm very much in line with Gregg's position on a lot of things. But I think one of the things that I'm noticing is that there's a very much of a blanket concept of access, expanded access, and of data. And I think there's different types of access. So there's individual, there's limited patient size populations, and there's these huge studies or huge programs where you can actually collect data. Currently, the IND regulations require, is this echoey or?
No.
Okay. That if you're delivering expanded access, then you should be submitting outcome data, a summary of the outcome data at the end, and you should file serious adverse event reports. And I think that's very reasonable, but the agency rarely even gets those because the physicians who are treating these patients are very busy. And I think if you're going to start piling more burdens on, less and less physicians are going to be willing to do that. And as you're moving more in the direction of research, then why isn't it just a research project? Because when I think back, and I've been there ever since the expanded access regulations came on board, the idea was to provide treatment, not for the purpose of research. And I think that line is really blurring. The other thought that kept going through my mind was that data is not data as just this blanket sort of, this is data. So having looked at data from the back of the curtain, I think that people at FDA really struggle with what kind of data they actually have to analyze. They get an analysis from the company, they reanalyze that data, and I think very often the outcome of what they come up with is very different. And I think if you've sat in or watched advisory committee meetings, a lot of times people will pose questions to the sponsor and they go like, well, we have this question, and the sponsor doesn't really have an answer. And I think because there are a lot of things that are so fungible and questionable, and you can spin them different ways and present them different ways. And so I think simply having data in hand doesn't mean you have useful and applicable and appropriate data in hand to answer all the questions you want to answer. So I feel like there's a slippery slope. And I think, your point about death by 1,000 cuts is very appropriate, because I think, science advances and there have been, movements toward having a gold standard for doing safety and efficacy studies. And I think that over the years, there's been a lot of lobbying efforts and a lot of regulatory changes that kind of are making the agency a little more flexible, but also sometimes compromising the type of data that comes into the agency. So just wanted to point those.
Richard highlights a huge takeaway for me from this last day and a half. There needs to be a plan for the data. I was, throughout those two EAPs, I was kicking and screaming, why is no data being collected? But maybe there was no plan for that. So just because you're collecting data, it needs to be focused. There needs to be a plan. So that's what I've learned in this last, yeah.
Any other responses before we go to the?
Hi everyone. Melissa DuPont, Global Public Affairs at Sanofi. Great to see everyone up here. Gwen, this question is directed to you. When we talk about data, we talk about how you participated on 2 expanded access programs. What data did you need to decide which one to participate on? Did you bring that information to your clinician? Did they bring it to you? And I think as we look at NIH and we see more expanded access programs in ALS, you know, what information is going to be needed for patients to make an informed decision, because there might be, it'll be great to see more access to treatments, but then, you know, how do you make that decision? And then extra data collection that might impact your participation.
Yeah, a great question. Thanks, Melissa. So I kept, you know, I'm full of questions. That's just me. So I was curious and concerned almost, and asked the research coordinator. A lot of times it's the research coordinator or nurse at study sites who is on the front lines for us, right? Collecting this data. So I kept asking, are we really not collecting any data? And they just sort of, they were lovely, but just sort of punted to the sponsor and said, well, this is, you know, the sponsor doesn't want any of that. It's not in the protocol. And I do think we talked about, Anne was great at sharing all of the guidance that exists for sponsors about flexibility, certainly lessons learned from COVID, telehealth. I just ask that you think of the patients. There needs to be, of course, we understand scientific rigor, and as long as there's, you know, a justifiable scientific explanation, or maybe the site needs to use its own labs, we get that. But as I mentioned, for things like ALS, FRS, that can be done on the phone. Other, you know, QOL surveys, things like that, over the phone. A blood draw, that could be a little trickier. There is flexibility, there's guidance to prove that. So just, I know I'm on your patient advisor board. I would say, you know, to sponsors, please have patient advisory board so you can hear our opinions firsthand.
Just a quick follow-up question. For your EAP participation, did you bring it to your clinician? Or did they bring that? Did they say, we know that there's a treatment that we would like to?
Oh, I always bring the information directly to my, yeah. However, I have to say, my neurologist is one of the best. So we have, and I'm lucky, I'm fortunate, we have open conversations about these things. But in the past, typically I brought the information.
Thanks, Gwen. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
Good morning, Peter Pitts. I'm the president of the Center for Medicine and the Public Interest, and a visiting fellow at NYU Langone. And like Richard, I'm ex-FDA, so thank you for the setup, Richard. A comment and a question. Firstly, relative to physicians providing care for their patients through an EAP, but not really having the time or oftentimes the desire or the expertise to participate in a research program, we need to stop saying that. It's kind of like saying, I prescribe drugs to my patients, but I don't want to report adverse events because I just want to fix the problem. I recognize it's a burden. I recognize it's complicated, but you can't just step away and say, this is what I do, and I don't do this. But I have a question I'd like to tee up for Anne. Hi, Anne. Part of the theory relative to progress and expanded access programs is that expanded access programs can wither away and die if companies would undertake more platform trials. So you have not necessarily an all-comers type of proposition, but that you're not restrictive relative to the category of patients that might be granted access to these programs, either through EAPs or through just straightforward recruitment. And I just want to know what your thoughts were.
So I'm not sure if I fully understand that you're talking about the balance between kind of innovative models like platform trials and expanded access.
Well, that one, you know, obviously it's never going to be one or the other,
Right.
but a more expanded view of platform trials would substantially decrease the reliance on EAPs.
I'm not certain I would see that as decreasing the reliance on EAPs. I think platform trials provide, as with any clinical investigation, it's still going to have some level of criteria for enrolling in a trial. And I think even to the extent that people look at how they're designing their trials and looking at our guidance on diversity and the 2018 guidance that really hones in on eligibility, I'm not certain that there won't remain a need for patients to have a pathway.
Sure. I'm just wondering, again, just to spread the hurt a little bit, you know, so it's not entirely on the physicians.
Yeah,
No.
no, and certainly our rare disease guidance that came out talks about platform trials, Bayesian approaches, adaptive designs and other ways that can help make the trials more efficient or make more accessible. And then those are things that, again, we encourage people to engage early with the review division on, so that, again, there is access there. I just think we will remain committed to having expanded access available and those pathways, even to the extent we're able to encourage designs that actually either permit people access because they're eligible or eliminate some of the geographic burdens or other challenges.
Great, thank you.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for the panel. Tobias Bolek from Erasmus University and Miles Morales. I had a question for Gregg, actually, because I was triggered when you said that the goal of expanded access was to get as many patients treated as possible. And therefore, we should not collect data. I actually think the converse might be true. We've seen a lot of examples where through data collection and expanded access, we got new insights, there was a label extension, and in the end, actually, it expanded access to more patients than if we had not potentially collected that data. So that was one question I had to you, what you think about it. And second, we hear a lot, and also Richie mentioned that expanded access is treatment. I disagree with that. I think if expanded access were purely treatment, we wouldn't have expanded access, right? We just make it available. Expanded access from its beginning has been in this uneasy sort of fit between research and treatment, right? You can say it's treatment, but it is regulated under the trial regulation. So it's not purely treatment, as it's not purely research either. So what are your thoughts on that?
So one benefit of being old is that you remember the beginning of things. And so expanded access in the parallel track was to get access to drugs. People were like, we cannot wait for the FDA to approve this drug. We want it now, right? And there are trade-offs. Once you start, and the D4T, the DDI and D4T expanded access collected mortality data, collected serious adverse events. Great. But as it starts to become more clinical trial-like, you're making trade-offs. And physicians have limited time, patients have limited time also. So I'm not saying that I'm not making a dichotomous statement as you seem to think. I'm just saying that expanded access really is originally conceived to get drugs into people's hands before the drugs were approved. There's a research component, but it's incredibly light and streamlined. I think there's another set of data around observational studies, which we might call real world evidence, which starts to look like a cohort study or an observational study, which is great. And we don't use them enough. But they're distinct. I think they're very distinct from each other. And as you start to move and blend the two, it becomes burdensome for everybody involved, right?
So ironically, as you continue to talk, I'm thinking there is an example in device side. We talk about expanded access or the EAP program, but in the device size, once you get a 510K or some very simple indication, then CMS has something called coverage with evidence development, which essentially says we will expand the access beyond the indication as long as we collect evidence to whether or not it works. I know it's different, but there's an analogy that people are willing to do that. It's not a research, it's a protocol. I think we have to get away from registries the way they used to be, but it still said it was important to collect the information.
Just be careful about what you wish for when it comes to device regulation, because it's much more Wild West than the drugs. Right?
Well, exactly why coverage with evidence development is so important.
Yeah, but I was wondering, shouldn't then the goal be to make it less burdensome and more easy to collect some little bit of data than just to dismiss the idea of data collection outright?
I agree with that.
So if we had a national healthcare system, we could collect, we work with VA data all the time. It's fantastic. Like we can ask causal questions and we're not disrupting anybody's lives. We're looking at retrospective data for 10 years. It's great. We don't have that system in the US. So it's very, very difficult unless you have these big health systems that are going to comply. You can use claims data, Geisinger, Kaiser. But in general, we don't have an infrastructure to do this in individual patient practice, individual clinicians' practices.
Although the EHR will transform that, the problem is, and there is the largest EHR company that does their own research enterprise and has whatever research.org. But I think there will be capabilities, and there are a number of companies that are pulling all that data in that can essentially do some of this work.
And one quick, I don't think anyone's dismissing the data, right? Or saying, let's not collect data. That's at least not what I've heard in the last couple of days. So yeah.
Thanks.
Good morning, Kathy Collett, individual ALS advocate, and thank you for this panel. I'm enjoying the discourse. There's one use of EAP data that you've not discussed, and I hope you will. In ALS land, there have been a few approvals. The FDA has granted broad ALS indication approval for a few therapies. Then payers say, wait a minute, the clinical trial was very narrow. We're only paying for people who fit the clinical trial inclusion criteria. If sponsors have some EAP data, the data don't have to be fancy schmancy clinical trial data. They can actually make some better arguments with payers to go ahead and cover things. So I think that's perhaps the highest use of EAP data. So I would be interested in your comments. Thank you.
So I think you're the only one here who's actually been in the position of making payment decisions. So what?
I think that's what we did, essentially, and that's what we did for the vaccines and gave the data back. So I think that's what coverage with evidence development. I think that's what the registries at CMS, just being the larger payer, and that's why we were asked by the payer community, hey, you guys do it, because nobody wanted to make that decision. And we did. But I just want to say one thing about all this evidence, and it's actually, I'm going to be careful about this, but our colleagues at a sister agency, and I don't mean the FDA, always ask for lots and lots of data, and it becomes academic. So I think the one key thing I think we all agree with is data that would be helpful in making informed decisions, as opposed to the scientific exercise is critical.
Hi, Ken Minkhouse, person living with ALS. Question for Gregg, and this is a question to try to bring the conversation back to ethics, and I'm not an ethicist, so this might be a very naive question. You and others have made it clear that there are trade-offs when we combine access and research in expanded access. And you leaning toward access first as the first priority. Does the ethical calculus change when the expanded access program is funded by taxpayer money? And here we go back to the Act for ALS, $500 million of taxpayer money that is going to help so far 410 of us out of 30,000 of us who currently have the disease to gain access to a therapy. And so far, none of the therapies have worked. So we're paying for about $150,000 to $200,000 per person for a Hail Mary pass. If taxpayers are paying for it, should there be a reasonable expectation of public good, not just private gain in this for the 410 people? And particularly when you take that cost benefit analysis into account, could we or should we be actually focusing more on the research, not only so it helps the 29,000 of us who don't get into the expanded access program, but it helps future generations of people who don't have ALS yet, but they will, as opposed to dropping all that money right now on a very small cohort of us.
So I'm generally in agreement with what you just said. The point is that Act for ALS is going to serve a very small population. It's giving money to the companies in advance of marketing approval, right? And if we did that in general, we start to upend sort of the regulatory environment by which we approve drugs, which the bargain is you don't get paid for it until you prove that it works, right? And so Act for ALS may solve a problem for a very few number of people living with ALS with drugs that probably don't work. But it opens up a can of worms. And I lots of friends who live with ALS who work for these organizations, I don't think it was thought through. I think people weren't thinking about the trade-offs in the right way. It was, as I said in the Nation article, I know that what that desperation feels like. I know what panic feels like, but it was policy panic. And I don't think it really works in the long term.
Gwen, your thoughts about that?
You can yell at me.
Super. No, I see both sides of the coin. I mean, Ken knows I'm a patient and I want to believe in these therapies. I maybe want to try them. I do want to see data first. So with me, safety and some positive signaling kind of trumps everything. Like I absolutely non-negotiable those two things. And I guess I'll end with this. I mean, we want better drugs, right? Like your friend Gregg was quoting a friend yesterday who's a breast cancer survivor, and she says, what we need is better medicines, drugs that work. So expanded access is great. Like a lot of this is, is hopeful for us. I don't want to take away the hope of access to hopefully some promising therapy. I do not want to take that away from anyone, but what we need is better drugs.
And I'll just say quickly that from observing this over the years, that there is this tension of this belief that earlier access is going to get people better drugs, because anybody can look at something that's already been approved and say, well, there was an earlier time when that drug wasn't approved, and if people had access to it, then they would have been helped. But of course, they don't look at all the things that dropped out along the way.
I have a question. I'm going to quasi-cheat. So Sonia Elling, I'm with IMALS. Was not here when the legislation was passed. Nice to meet you, Ken. We've always been on Zoom. He kind of set me up. So it's technically only been 175 million that's been, and actually that's if we count FY24, that's kind of rolling down a really slow hill in Congress right now. So it's not been that 500 million, and we only have 2 years of funding left. So it won't be 500 million. And then some of that money has gone for the public-private partnership and ag grants for neurodegenerative diseases. So I can't help it. The former Senate staff for me is wondering, like, this is actually, it's a little misleading. It's not 500 million, but I appreciate your point, Ken. And I had a data question, but I feel like we had a long debate on that already. So I'm going to corner some of you one off. But I wanted to build on Melissa's question. And you can answer it, Gwen, but I'd rather maybe Anne answer it first in regards to helping patients and clinicians be more aware of EAP and how to encourage those conversations, and especially for people living with, I'll focus on ALS, but people living in rural areas or people that don't live and don't have access to a neurologist like Gwen. Sounds like she has an amazing one. So we'd love to figure out how we could, ideas to figure out how to make people aware of it, and so they could ask their doctor about it, and then also to figure out how more clinicians can start raising that or even being aware of it. So thank you.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. I mean, that's, coming out of, there was a 2018 report that was put out, that it was an evaluation of our expanded access programs. And I think a key point was awareness. I think some of that you see in kind of the communications from the agency, the programs that are starting, like Project Facilitate. So it is an area that we continue to focus on. And it's not, to be honest, just about expanded access. I think there's also kind of how do you make patients, how do you make clinicians available about where the clinical trials are. So there's a lot of, I think, effort within the agency to be able to make the information as easily available and as understandable as possible, so that somebody who is, to Gregg's point, coming in from busy clinic wants to think through or is interested in pursuing expanded access, that they're not spending hours trying to figure it out, that there is a point of contact. So you're an oncology healthcare professional that they can engage with who will help them walk through the way. It's not perfect, but I think we are definitely an area that we are committed to not only making sure people are aware of it, but really rapidly reviewing requests. I think one thing we haven't touched on is that generally FDA permits the vast majority of expanded access requests that it gets to proceed. We may provide input on things like the dosing regimen or the informed consent form, but I think it's something that we will continue to invest in.
Did you have ideas, Gwen? I wasn't trying to cut you off, Gwen. I was definitely curious about Ann, and I know you guys have been great, and Dr. Korshis have been great in regards to even just getting the word out about the EAP, so that, and that's the other thing, just if people don't know, it's actually, I would argue, can't necessarily dismantle the entire system potentially, because it is limited by Congress to the small manufacturers, and so that's caused limited access to even companies being able to, and sponsors to apply even for the Act for ALS EAPs. To actually then make them available. So that's been part of the challenge too, but I think that was done with the intent to make sure that, well, anyways, I won't speak for politicians, but they had reasonings behind why they did it that way.
Yeah, and I think to be more firm, and Sonia's point, she is being nice. A lot of this information is just not getting to clinicians, right? Like, I know there, and maybe, I don't know what the solution is, but maybe sponsors need to be better at communicating some of this with clinicians. They are truly on the front lines. I don't know what the answer is, but to Sonia's point, clinicians need more of this information in hand. It will certainly help patients make a better informed decisions. It'll better inform the clinicians. And if it's a small clinic that, that can handle these decisions or volume or whatever, refer us to another clinic who can, but it's the worst when we're, shut down by, someone who we trust, our frontline subject matter expert.
So my biggest concern is if you look at many clinicians, those who are outside of academic medical centers, they really remember what they learned during residency. And once they've left, that knowledge, and I wouldn't know necessarily before I came to the federal government where to go on the FDA website, no offense, to find a lot of this information. So I think, and I brought up AI, but I think as patient advocate groups think about this and how they put things out there so that it can be found, one of the places that I have such great respect for is the Emory Alzheimer's group went out and found, through a grant from Georgia, like 6 centers in the most rural areas, and they created a collaborative in order to give these drugs. And I think encouraging in any states or some of the places that understand the process how to partner so that those places that are more rural can, through telehealth, also get to answer questions, I think would be the most powerful thing possible.
Thank you for sharing your insights. My name is Rachel Harrison. I'm from Argenx Pharmaceuticals. And as I sit and listen to the conversation on data collection, I wonder if, because all of us here in this room, our hearts are so big and we're all trying to do the right thing, I wonder if we're trying to do too much. From a small pharma perspective, is it enough for us to collect data from our patients in a trial, in an expanded access program, to use in our submissions to the regulatory authorities, or perhaps to expand a label and stop there, rather than trying to have it, externally collected and cleaned and mined, collect the data through the program, use it for our immediate purposes, and then try to get drugs to market for the wider population of patients. I hear all of this conversation about collecting data and how hard it is and how expensive it is, but if we keep it in-house and use it for those immediate purposes, is that enough? I
Well,
wonder.
and I would expand that just a little bit. I mean, that really does raise the question of whose data is it? And should this data be out there to help other patients and be made public to the medical community and patient community, or should it, because it's more convenient, it's easier, maybe there are proprietary reasons why you want to keep it in your companies? I think this is going to have to be our last question. I'm going to give Ann and anybody else that wants a shot.
Yeah, I mean, I think the data that you could, certainly we would kind of expect that all the clinical trial data and expanded access data, those are all under IND, are something that the FDA would consider as part of a decision about approval. I think what I would highlight in terms of making data available from clinical trials is that companies have an obligation to post the results of their trials to clinicaltrials.gov. So after 1 year after primary completion date, so I think those data should be available in summary form. There's also I think there was an article we had discussed that was looking at the outcomes of FDA reviews. FDA makes its reviews after an approval also publicly available. So in essence, people are able to see things then. I'm not sure from a company perspective, I guess I'm not fully appreciating the question of, isn't that enough? I think certainly, it's going to depend on the particular product and kind of information that you need for the particular use you're seeking. So maybe you could shed a little bit of light on.
What I mean is, if that's all that we're able to do as a small company, is it better than nothing at all? So instead of just not collecting data because we're not able to share it with the patients and the clinicians and everyone, is it enough to use it internally and try to advance that drug development? I think some small companies are feeling overwhelmed at the prospect.
So I guess we had a question about, are you talking about within a randomized controlled trial or outside of
within
it?
expanded
Or
access.
So for expanded access, I think, if you are engaging in that kind of program, that's under an IND. So that would need to be something that is, the safety information, for example, provided to the agency. And again, that would be part of the considerations and the totality of the data reviewed. I think I'm interested in others' thoughts on the panel about, is that enough? I think certainly companies would need to be kind of fully evaluating kind of to meet the statutory standard for substantial evidence of efficacy and kind of reasonable assurance of safety. I think certainly maybe what I'll close with, since I see Allison stepping to the stage, is that kind of in all of this, really should be engaging patients and understanding kind of what their outcomes of interest to them when you're kind of thinking about the design of your trials, when you're thinking about the kind of data you're going to collect, because that's something that I think for me is one of the most important aspects of being at the agency, is really ensuring that patient voice is heard.
Thank you.
And thank you all. I think it's a great discussion. We could have kept on going, but we can't. So thanks a lot.